I remember the little house we lived in, which wasn't very far, and I remember that he got his eye hurt. A piece of steel flew into it, and he had to go. They sent him into Omaha to have it fixed. And I can remember when he got home how tickled I was to see him. Is that enough? Yes, maybe it's when I had a new baby brother. The the dust days, they were terrible. It would just get dark. There would be so much dust in the air. And then the house would be full of dust. And it would take, you would have to sweep and end up mopping to pick up this dust. And then about the time you got everything cleaned up, here'd come another dust storm. I went to a country Sunday school, and there were two other country Sunday schools in the general area, and we all had a big picnic in a pasture where there were trees on Children's Day, which they used to always celebrate in Sunday school. Oh, and the only award I can think of was that I had perfect attendance awards several times. I didn't miss very much school. Probably the first car that we had. See, we had always gone in a horse and buggy. We just had one horse we drove, and we lived. When I first moved to the country, we lived about 7 miles from town, which took quite a while to go. And then later, I lived 5 miles from town. And so when we got the car, why, it really seemed like you were going fast. Well, do you want some more about school? When I was in the 2nd grade, my folks moved close to Beaver City, and I went to school there. And the 3rd and 4th grade were in a little white schoolhouse down on the corner of the lot. We weren't in the big schoolhouse. And I was promoted to the 4th grade. So you see, I'd had a really good teacher when I was in country school. And then I went to Beaver School till I was in the 7th grade, and I moved back in the country, farther out in the country, and went 7th and 8th grade out in the country. And it was a small school, but we had our own pump, so we didn't have to carry water. It was fun. We used to play games at recess. Fox and Goose, if there was snow on the ground, was fun. And then we played Red Rover, and we played some kind of racing game where you took sides and then run from one side to the other. I don't know whether it had a name or not. Then I went back to Beaver City for high school. My chore was to get in fuel, and we had cobs and we had wood. We lived down along the creek, so Grandpa always chopped wood, and we had wood to bring in. But mostly cobs, and we had lots of cobs, so we brought in lots of cobs. We had a big old wash tub, and we'd fill it. Now my brother and I, and then we'd stand the cobs up all around and fill it up higher, so it was big. And then we couldn't carry it, so Grandma would come in from milking or feeding her chickens, and she'd take a hold of one side of the tub, and I'd take a hold of the other side, and we'd bring it in. And then besides that, we'd probably fill 2 or 3 bushel baskets, which we could bring in ourselves. Used to come stay with, my grandma and grandpa used to come stay with us, maybe a month or 2. And I remember Grandpa, he was always good for a good place to sit for a lap, And he used to sing to us kids, and the song I remember was Go Tell Aunt Rhody, which is a folk song, and it was Go Tell Aunt Rhody the old gray goose is dead. That was one sentence. I can't remember the rest of it. And my grandma had a very rare disease called acromegaly, and her terminals, her fingers and her feet, grew after she was in her 50s, and it was very, very painful. And she finally went to Rochester, and they took her goiter, which was pressing against the thyroid gland, which had caused this, but there wasn't anything they could do about it. And she died when she was 62 or 3, and I thought she was an old lady. Let's see. I can't remember what my favorite food was, but I remember what wasn't, because Mother and Dad always raised potatoes, and there was bugs on them, so they poisoned them with Paris green, which was green. And I was so told to stay away from that I wouldn't eat anything that was green at all. So, and to this day I don't care much for peas. And for entertainment, I had kids come to the house a little bit, you know, the school kids. But I think I remember most that Mother and Dad pretty nearly always had company on Sunday. If nobody was there for dinner, somebody drop in the afternoon, and it would be neighbors or uncles and aunts. And they most all of them had kids, so we had somebody to play with. First car we had was an Overland, and then I'm not sure what we had next, but then we ended up with a big Dodge sedan. And at that time you didn't have to be 16 to get a driver's license. And so I learned to drive probably when I was 14. I never did drive very far, but just around. We lived 8 miles south of Hendley, so I had just roads to drive, you know, just country roads to drive on. When I lived on a farm, my dad had horses. He farmed all the time with horses. And a lot of the machinery run like a one-row lister, run with just 2 head of horses, a team. And then some of the things he had to have 4, but he never did have more than 4 horses to drive when he worked. And he shucked corn by hand, had a shucking peg. And you put sideboards on one side of the wagon, so when you threw up the corn, it would hit the sideboard and stay in the wagon. And then we had alfalfa, and he had a mower that just went along. It was a long arm that come out that had blades, V-shaped blades in it that worked back and forth to cut the alfalfa. And they had a rake, and then you stacked by hand. Somebody was on the stack making a haystack. And the same way with wheat. They had to have somebody, you know, they harvested wheat. I only knew harvesting wheat with a header. And you had a header barge, which was kind of like this wagon that you shuck corn in. It was high on one side so the wheat wouldn't drop off, and then they'd drive in and stack it. Somebody'd be on the stack, and they made beautiful stacks by hand. They knew just how far to put the hay out of the stuff out. And then some people did theirs with a binder, which cut bundles, and then they set them up in shocks. And then the big old thrash machine come along, and you had several men stay over with you, you know, while they thrashed. It didn't go very fast. The heat was all by fuel, wood, cobs, and possibly some coal. And this was the only way. So you steamed up the old cook stove about every day, no matter how hot it was. Tried to bake and do things like that in the morning so you wouldn't have to do much after it got so hot. You heated the house with a stove, a heating stove. It'd be setting off here in the living room with a pipe up, a stovepipe up the side and into the wall, into the chimney. The worst chore I had was wash the separator. It had to be done every morning, and I did it just as quick as I could to get done with it. Water, I was lucky because I had a pump from a cistern inside the house, but most people had to carry the water in from an outdoors well. So let's see, we washed I had a wash machine with a wooden tub and a flywheel, so you moved the handle back and forth, and that run the agitator in the washing machine faster than you moved, so it was easy, and you get it to going, why it would almost go by itself for a few times. I heated water on a little, what they call a little topsy stove, and and you boiled your white clothes. You put lye in the water, and then you got it boiling, and then you skimmed, just before it boiled, you skimmed the lye off. That softened the water. Then you put in your soap, and you boiled your white clothes to keep them white. Of course, everything had to be hung on the line. They didn't even know what a dryer was. In the wintertime, this got to be a problem. Everything just stood straight out, when it froze. And underclothes looked real funny hanging on the line. We didn't have anything like a toaster or a mixer or anything like that. We strictly used the wood stove and the oven. And when we toasted bread, we cleaned off the top of the stove and laid the bread on and watched it and turned it. My paternal grandfather came from Germany when he was 15, and after hearing all about goes on where the Statue of Liberty is, Ellis Island, how they took care of the people when they came, I feel sure that some German people took care of him when he got there, and then we don't know anything about him until he got to Illinois, and that's where he married grandmother, and he died very young and left a family, but before he died, he had come out to Nebraska and bought some land, so grandmother moved the family out, and they had a really hard time. My other grandparents came from the eastern part of the country and worked their way like everybody as the country developed, they worked their way this way, and relatives would come ahead and then they'd follow them. And my mother then first lived around Kearney. When grandmother brought her after grandpa died and grandmother brought the family to Nebraska, they came by train, and so the trains were developed in this area, and they came as far as Hendley, and they brought their things in a boxcar. All their belongings came with them. My family always farmed. I lived on a farm practically all my life, and so did my grandparents all live on farms. As far as I know, my grandparents were lucky enough to live in frame houses, but I have been inside houses, and the ones I were in were very nice, not like the first ones that came. They had plastered walls and floors. In fact, when I was a kid, there was an old side house on the place, and it had been knocked down on two sides, part of it, and we used it for a garage for a while. I guess my favorite grandparent was my grandma Mellinger, and she sewed, and she was a milliner. Everybody all the ladies wore hats, and they didn't have anything to go on. They made them from scratch, so it was an art to be able to make a hat. The worst flood that I ever knew about was when the Republican River flooded in 35, and we lived south of the river, and we used to go and look down on the valley where the water was. But one night our neighbors were over there, and they came back with a story that they had found a body, and it was a woman, and the only thing they had to go by was a shoe. And they kept that body at Beaver City for a month, hoping to find who it was, and then buried it in the cemetery with a plaque that says, a woman, a Republican flood victim. And that morning, Jody's grandpa was born. So that would be 1935. The birthday cake from Jody's great-grandpa's side of the family was a white cake frosted with whipped cream and covered with walnuts on top. And this had been the birthday cake as the family came along, you know. And the special thing from the other side of the family, my side of the family, that I remember that's different was a steamed suet pudding. Your great-grandpa Lloyd saw 3 presidents. He saw Kennedy up in South Dakota, Eisenhower in McCook, and Nixon in North Platte. Our family only purchased what had already been homesteaded. Oh, let's blink it off. Jody's great-great-grandmother and her son homesteaded in Wyoming. That was one of the last places you could homestead.